Hey everybody. Okay, today we're going to cover how to change your disc brake pads. We'll be doing this on the front wheel, but the procedure is basically the same for the back wheel. And I have the bike up on a motorcycle stand just to make it a little more easy to access. But this operation can easily be done with the bike just sitting on its center stand on the ground. Well, can easily be done, but you'll be bending over some more. And tools required are very straightforward. We need a set of metric Allen keys, and we need a pair of needle nose pliers to open up the cotter pin. So, to change our disc brake pads on the Electrom, to get at the pads on the Zoom Shimano compatible brakes, you need the disc brake rotor out of the way. There's two ways you can accomplish this. You could take the front wheel off, which requires undoing the front wheel axle bolts and undoing the torque arrest bolt, or we could simply undo the brake caliper and pull the whole caliper away from the bike, and that allows us to access the pads. So that's what we're going to do in this case because it's much easier. So I'll take my Allen key, I will loosen off and then undo our Allen key bolts, and these are 6mm bolts, which is pretty standard for disc brake mounts. And as always, when working with disc brakes, it's very important not to contaminate your disc brake pads or your disc brake rotor with any fluids or oils. So I've cleaned my hands before this operation. Here are my two bolts. Should probably have a little parts tray to hold on to those. So now our disc brake caliper is free. I'm going to bend the cotter pin back to flat. So now that cotter pin is flat, and I can pull it out, and it comes out nicely. And now my old pads come out simply by pressing on the back of the whole assembly, and the pads come out. And these are brand new pads, by the way, so I'm just going to put them back in. But we now have the scenario where our pads are free and our new pads are ready to go in. And what this assembly consists of is a left pad and a right pad and a return spring. Our return spring wants to be around the pad, and once again I'm being very careful not to touch the actual pad surface with my fingers. I'm just touching the metal holder that's on the back side of it. And then our other pad goes on like this. So we now have a complete pad assembly, and we're ready to slide it back into the caliper. These are ambidirectional, so it doesn't matter which way they go in. However, the little tab has to be on the back because that's where the cotter pin is to hold it. So I'll squeeze them together and I will push the pads into place. Now, should you be tempted to squeeze the brake lever at any point in this operation, please do not. Each time you squeeze the brake lever, if there's no pad or calipers in the way or brake rotors in the way to resist that travel, the pads will travel out and they might not go all the way back to where they belong. And so what that scenario is called pumping up. Basically, you pump up your caliper to the point where you can no longer get the rotor back in between. So when there is no pads in place and no rotor between them, do not squeeze the brake lever. So now we're ready to reinstall our cotter pin, and it just slides in. It's quite obvious where it goes. And I will bend it back to position. The cotter pin's job is just to hold the brake pads in place. So you don't have to go crazy on bending it. It just has to be such that the cotter pin won't slide out. And I'm going to bend that a little bit more. There. So that cotter pin's in there nice and well. It's not going to come out. Then the caliper goes back on the assembly. One pad on each side of the disc brake rotor, and then our bolts go in. And I should say, of course, that This video is specific to the Electrom, but there are lots of great videos out there on how to maintain and look after your disc brakes. And as long as they are similar to this in terms of a Shimano compatible disc brake, then most of the information in them will be accurate. So I'm going to do these caliper mounts up to the point where they're just for snug. So we don't want them tight because we want the caliper to be able to move around a little bit, because the next thing we do is we give the wheel a spin and make sure that the caliper is centered on the rotor. Now, it's very likely that you will be unable to get the caliper perfectly centered so that neither pad is touching in any way all the time. Don't worry about it, because the fact is this is very little drag, and after a couple of times of using your disc brakes, you will wear that pad surface a little bit and they'll no longer be touching and there won't be any drag. But another thing you can do is, as you spin the wheel, look at the gap between the pad and the disc brake rotor from behind and just line it up as best you can visually. And when it's aligned, then tighten up these bolts. And I still like to kind of do this in stages. I give it a little tighten, give it a little test, little tappy tappy, maybe some loosening, and just get it lined up as best you can. Once you're confident that you've aligned it as well as you can, then give these disc brake bolts a nice tighten. Now, I know people don't think in terms of human torque wrenches, but these are supposed to be torqued to about 4 or 5 Newton meters of torque. So that's pretty good. I've got a slight rub. As I said, that rub will go away in probably 10 minutes into my first ride. So that's it. That's how to change the pads on your Electrom disc brake. Okay, that's it. That's the changing of the disc brake pads for the Electrom. And as I said before, it's the same procedure on the rear. You take the caliper off using your Allen key. You make sure your hands are clean. You use your pliers to remove the cotter pin. You pop out your old pads. You pop in your new pads and your return spring and line it back up. One of the things I do want to point out to you guys, though, is I'll just turn the camera here a little bit. I'm using a fairly inexpensive motorcycle repair stand, and it's a hydraulic lift with a foot pump. And I highly recommend you get yourself one of these. They're about $100, and it really makes working on your Electrom so much less of a chore to have it up and off the ground. And so, yes, I highly recommend it at, if you're in Canada, Canadian Tire or Princess Auto, or if you're in the United States, any decent hardware store or, say, Harbor Freight will have something like this. You can get them with rollers on them as well. Now, the one thing is that I do want to show you is that even with the stand all the way down, the Electrom is off the ground. So to get the bike up onto the stand, I typically lift it from the rear end of the bike and slide it up onto the stand and then put it down. Fairly straightforward, requires a bit of strength, but not too much. Okay, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more videos.